Supreme Court held oral arguments on Monday in a case relating to mail in ballots. The question, and the case comes out of Mississippi, the question is whether states are permitted to count mail in ballots that arrive after Election Day. There are 14 states in which, if a mail in ballot is postmarked on Election Day and arrives within some time frame, think 4 or 5, 6 days, it'll be counted. These laws have been on the books for years, but since 2020, they've been a target of Donald Trump and the Republican Party. Why? Because Donald Trump blames mail in balloting for his defeat in 2020, although he insisted he didn't lose the election. Trump says that mail in balloting is susceptible to huge amounts of fraud. He says that fraud is the reason that he lost, fraud because of mail in balloting. And Trump and Republicans who support him say that the issue is that mail in ballots change the results, that the results are reported, and then all these ballots come in and they just magically change the election result to favoring a Democrat. According to the court reporters that I follow, the conservative justices on the court, or I should say the Republican justices on the court, were very amenable to the argument that there was something fishy about counting late arriving mail-in ballots, and that mail-in balloting and absentee balloting themselves are somewhat suspicious in some way. Samuel Alito apparently was very much of the view that mail-in ballots did have a higher chance of being fraudulent. Now, if you've watched my videos on the SAVE Act and just on voting in general, you'll know a critical fact that the odds of voter fraud, the prevalence of voter fraud, is extraordinarily low. It's basically non-existent. Now, a couple related points here. The first is that for all of the president's obsession with ending mail-in balloting, this is a part of the SAVE Act, which would effectively end mail-in balloting in the country if it were passed into law. For all the obsession, this particular thing, allowing late arriving ballots to be counted, wouldn't have helped Trump. The 6 key swing states that determined the 2020 election don't have that provision on the book, so it sort of doesn't really matter to Trump. This is him looking for some excuse. The second thing, and this I think is underrated in how much of a distortion it is when you're thinking about elections, is that if ballots come in and it changes the count when you're watching TV or whatever, the results haven't changed. I need you to understand that. If only 90% of the votes have been counted, or only 90% of the precincts have reported their tallies, and you have a state of the election, right? This is where things look like right now. And then more ballots come in, more ballots are counted, more precincts report, and that changes. The results haven't changed. What you're seeing are the results. I know Trump has this notion that the election only happens on election day, and all the votes counted on election day are the only ones that count, and the election day total represents the results, and that any further ballots that come in, whether absentee or mail-in or whatever, are somehow a distortion of this. They're changing the result. But no, the result is only when all the ballots have been counted, or enough of the ballots have been counted to make a determination. The results, the full results, are only when all the ballots are counted. The results are when all the ballots are counted. And so, if you think you've won because it's a close election, you're down by 5,000 votes, and it seems like all the votes have been counted, but they haven't, that there are still votes to be counted, and when they count those votes, you've lost, the results haven't changed. There hasn't been fraud. They just counted all the votes, and you lost. And I do think, and this is speaking as a member of the media, I suppose, I do think the extent to which election nights are treated like football games, are treated like big sporting events, that we have these counts, these real-time updates, we have these color-coded maps. I do think all of this creates this impression that what's happening is like a game, like a basketball game, where one side is ahead and the other side is behind, and the other side catches up, and so on and so forth. And that when votes come in, sides are catching up, and there's something active and dynamic happening on the field. But by the time they're counting the votes, the game has been played. Imagine a basketball game where they don't visibly keep track of the tally, and where each basket is hidden behind some veil that obscures what happens when everything comes up close. You can't actually see who's scoring, right? And then at the end of the game, when the players are off the field, they actually then tally the score and they tell you who won. If, as they're doing a real time counting of the score, things are going back and forth, one side's up, one side's down, nothing's actually changing. It's still static. The game has already been played. And this is the case with voting. The game has been played. Nothing changes. You just have to count all the votes. And I do think the way that we treat elections, with the media reports on elections, creates this impression of a dynamic system when on election night, when the votes are being counted, you're just seeing who won. Number three, the extent to which the Republican members of the Supreme Court seem to take seriously claims of fraud when it comes to mail in balloting is, to me, one of those signs that these people are as brain curdled as any kind of Fox News grandpa. In fact, that they are literally Fox News grandpas in the case of Alito and Thomas in particular. That their minds have pickled and MAGA slop as much as any pardoned January 6er. These suggestions of mail in balloting fraud come directly from the mind of Trump. They're circulated in conservative media. They have no basis in fact. They're pure conservative conspiracism meant to sow distrust in elections. And the fact that Supreme Court justices are repeating them back during oral arguments is another one of many troubling signs of the media environment in which these people operate. I add additionally that the justices just don't know that much about election administration, and they are bringing a bunch of suppositions to it. And one of the suppositions they're bringing is the idea that mail in balloting hurts Republicans, again, as per Trump. But the evidence is awash there. Mail in balloting allows people who don't normally vote to vote. And lately, that has benefited Republicans. And in places that are rural and where there are lots of older and elderly voters, mail in balloting allows them to participate, helping Republicans. So, this is another one of those things where I think the Republican justices might be thinking, oh, we're going to benefit, we're going to help our party out. And on election related cases, the Republican justices consistently vote in ways that benefit the Republican Party. But I think they may have a mistaken notion of what might benefit the Republican Party in this circumstance. The last thing I'll say is that there's this idea among conservatives that our current status quo of voting in many states, where voting is not on a single day, but it's rather a process that involves mail in balloting and absentee balloting and all kinds of different methods of casting a ballot. There's a view among conservatives that this is somehow illegitimate, that this is a change from the way things ought to be and the way things were meant to be, which is that we all go to the polls on one day and we cast a ballot. But the truth of the matter is that the way we do voting now actually has a lot in common with the way we did voting into the 19th century, where there weren't really standard elections, and election day didn't really exist. It was more like election month or election season. People would begin voting months before the official election day, and results would trickle out gradually over time. That is basically how we did elections until the rise of modern communications, until it became possible to quickly transmit information from point A to point B. And so, if you're looking at this from an historical basis, the level of flexibility we have in voting today, the amount of time we set aside to allow people to vote, that is much more in keeping with the American tradition of voting than this highly restrictive, very narrow idea that, oh, election day is the only day you get to vote, and if you can't get to it, too bad. That is kind of out of keeping with how Americans have voted in the past, as it should be. Voting is a right, it is a constitutional right. If you are an American citizen, you have the right to vote. And although there's no constitutional amendment stating that there is an affirmative right to vote, it remains the case that the job of the state, of your state government, the federal government, ought to be to facilitate voting, to make it easier to vote and participate, and not to put burdens on it. Likewise for the court. I think the court's jurisprudence should start from a position that voting is a right that has to be protected, and that the court's role is to ensure democratic participation, not to find ways to allow others to restrict it. I know that's probably asking for a lot, but I don't say these things because I think they're going to happen. I say these things because I think they are true. All right. See you next time.